In this video, we'll discuss several different forms of sexism, for example, old-fashioned sexism, modern sexism, and ambivalent sexism, as well as the methods that psychological scientists use to measure them. I use these measures commonly in my research, for example, in my research on the brilliance equals men stereotype, although I didn't really discuss anything about explicit measures in that video because it was already getting really long. And I've found that they correlate significantly with implicit measures of sexism, such as the implicit association test, or IAT. So these are really valuable tools to have in your toolkit as a researcher. So for all these different forms of sexism, they're relatively similar in that they're scales. They typically involve asking participants to rate their agreement with a series of statements, for example, on a 1 equals strongly disagree to 7 equals strongly agree scale. And the exact numbers there, how big the scale is, and what the labels are for different points of the scale, that might differ from scale to scale, but we don't really care about that for this video. In this video, I'll talk about the main 5 forms of sexism that we typically focus on and use in social psychological research. So let's start with old-fashioned sexism and modern sexism. These are particularly interesting because they allow us to better understand how sexism has qualitatively changed and evolved over time. So let's focus first on the old-fashioned sexism scale. Notice how direct, or explicit, I guess you could say, these scale items are. One scale item reads, "Women are generally not as smart as men." It's pretty extreme, pretty direct, right? We also include some reversed items, so it's kind of the opposite. Number 2 there, for example, says, "I would be equally comfortable having a woman as a boss as a man." Hopefully you agree with that statement, right? If you disagree with it, so the opposite, then that's sexist. And at the end of the day, whoever's using this scale, the researcher would reverse those reversed items so that higher scores also mean sexism, just like high scores, high agreement on that first statement would mean sexism as well. We don't really care about the methods behind it as much as the items here, but I thought that would be interesting to mention. Now let's focus on the modern sexism scale, which is going to look very different. Notice how indirect these items are. You can see that this scale is also divided into 3 subscales. For example, the denial of continuing discrimination. It's sexist to believe that sexism, that discrimination, is not a problem. So we have items here that say, discrimination against women is no longer a problem in the United States. If you agree with that, that's sexist because we know it is a problem. You're downplaying these issues because they don't necessarily apply to you or something, right? We also have antagonism toward women's demands as another subscale. For example, it is easy to understand the anger of women's groups in America, or it's easy to understand why women's groups are concerned about societal limitations of women's opportunities. If you disagree with that, it's sexist. And finally, resentment about special favors for women. Over the last few years, the government and news media have been showing more concern about the treatment of women than is warranted by women's actual experiences. So you can see these are much less direct. It's not like we're saying, oh, women are less intelligent, right? It's not that extreme, I guess you could say. This is much more subtle, but nonetheless, these ideologies are still sexist. And so we call this modern sexism because you're more likely to see people agreeing with these kinds of statements nowadays because they seem a little bit more acceptable, even if they're wrong. Remember how prejudice involves emotions? Well, prejudice can also take the form of ambivalence. Ambivalence is a word meaning sort of having mixed feelings about something. And researchers have developed the idea of ambivalent prejudice and ambivalent sexism as a product of ambivalent prejudice to describe these sort of mixed forms of prejudice and sexism. And they've specifically differentiated between 2 different forms of sexism that together make up this sort of ambivalent sexism. So we have hostile sexism and benevolent sexism. So let's take a look at a few sample items from the Ambivalent Sexism Inventory, which is made up of the hostile and benevolent sexism scales, or subscales if you want to think of them that way, to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. In this table, you're looking at several scales that measure sexism in different ways, including modern sexism, which we just discussed, as well as a couple scales that we haven't and won't discuss. But let's focus specifically on the ambivalent sexism inventory. So for benevolent sexism, we have, for example, every man ought to have a woman who he adores, and a good woman should be set on a pedestal by her man, right? So these sound very positive, very nice, very chivalrous and romanticizing statements, right? We'll get back to that in just a minute because it's still sexism, right? And then we have hostile sexism, and you're going to see a very qualitatively different style, different aura here. Women are too easily offended. Once a woman gets a man to commit to her, she usually tries to put him on a tight leash, right? Much more hostile and negative, as you can hopefully see. So, as you can probably glean from those sample items, hostile sexism can be defined as a set of attitudes that regards women as inferior to men, that assigns women to traditional and subordinate roles, gender roles, and also considers women as primarily sexual objects. So people who score high on measures of hostile sexism, like that ambivalent sexism scale or inventory, tend to believe that women are capable of and ultimately are interested in controlling men through female sexuality or feminist ideology. Can you tell why we call this hostile? Benevolent sexism, in contrast, sort of represents, at least how I like to think of it, the dark side of chivalry. Benevolent sexism is a set of paternalistic, and we've seen that word before, sort of like fatherly, right? A set of paternalistic and positive attitudes toward women that regards women as refined objects to be protected and cared for. And high scores on measures of benevolent sexism are associated with romanticizing women's sexuality rather than seeing it as threatening. They're also associated with seeing women as emotionally weaker, but morally superior and deserving of adoration and sacrifice from men. Now you might be wondering, is benevolent sexism actually all that bad? Well, it is altruistic and well-intentioned, but benevolent sexist beliefs envision women as weaker than men, and so reinforces what we call the patriarchy, a social system in which men have most of the power, status, and resources compared to women. Benevolent sexism reinforces traditional gender role stereotypes in the service of sociocultural status quo maintenance, keeping things the way they are, and in a patriarchy, the way they are is that men are on top. So while the intentions are usually good, the results can be harmful for women. For example, Peter Glick and Susan Fiske, and you might recognize these names, by the way, because they also developed the stereotype content model that we learned about before. Peter Glick and Susan Fiske, as well as several collaborators, conducted a cross-cultural investigation of ambivalent sexism by recruiting over 15,000 participants across 19 different nations, and they found that both hostile and benevolent sexism, both of them, were significantly associated with some pretty negative things for women. For example, lower rates of women, lower percentages of women in management and professional occupations, lower life expectancy for women compared to men, lower levels of education for women compared to men, and finally lower purchasing power for women compared to men, meaning the men in these societies tended to hold most of the financial responsibility in the household. And in this study, they found that hostile sexism of men was greater than that of women, which is perhaps unsurprising. But interestingly, benevolent sexism of men was equal to that of women. So women were equally happy to endorse and agree with those benevolent sexist statements. Why do you think this might be the case? I would hypothesize that this is because benevolent sexism doesn't really feel oppressive, right? It feels like a positive thing. But nonetheless, as we can see here, it is.